The war, that glorious 9-year stretch of global real estate speculation and subsidized European melodrama, didn't start with a crown declaration or a grand military parade. It started as most profoundly embarrassing historical conflicts do, with a 22-year-old in a poorly chosen hat, a hastily constructed wooden fence, and a catastrophic bureaucratic blunder involving a language barrier. It was 1754, in the thick, unforgiving wilderness outside what would one day become modern-day Pittsburgh, a location only an 18th century bureaucrat could deem strategically vital. Our protagonist, Lieutenant Colonel George Washington of the British militia, was less a hardened warrior and more an ambitious young Virginian landowner, desperate to prove himself, preferably without getting actual dirt on his bright new uniform. He had built a stockade, which he optimistically dubbed Fort Necessity. Unfortunately, as the name suggests, it was built out of necessity, not architectural brilliance, and was situated perfectly at the bottom of a valley, offering the French and their allied native American forces the tactical advantage of shooting downhill, which, historically, is much easier. Washington was cornered. After a brief skirmish 5 weeks prior had resulted in the death of French ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, an event the French considered flat-out murder. The French now had Washington pinned down on the damp evening of July 3rd. The French commander, knowing he had the upper hand, sent a surrender document. The document was, naturally, written entirely in French. Now, Washington had many virtues: height, ambition, and a future career in political stubbornness. Speaking French was not one of them. "Sir," stuttered one of his junior officers, peering at the ornate script under the flickering lantern light. "It appears to be a formal request for your capitulation. But there's a clause, Washington," sweat plastering. His wig to his scalp waved dismissively. "Well, sign it then. Hurry up. It's raining, and this valley is quickly becoming a miserable bog. Just tell me we get to leave with our colors." The clause, which Washington was blissfully or ignorantly confessing to, specifically stated that he was admitting to the assassination of Jumonville. This was the 18th century equivalent of signing a contract, agreeing to clean the French commander's stables for life, while simultaneously confessing to grand larceny. Washington signed the document, thereby accidentally providing France with the perfect, globally broadcast casus belli, an official, written confession that a British officer had committed murder. He marched out, though, next morning, July 4th. Head bowed in acute embarrassment. The world had just stumbled into a war over North American real estate, officially kicked off by a clerical error. Later, reflecting on his humiliating defeat and the sound of enemy fire, Washington would write to his brother, "I have heard bullets whistle and believe. To me there was something charming in the sound." This, dear viewer, is the core truth of the 7 Years' War, a global conflict spanning 5 continents, responsible for countless deaths, financed entirely because one young man found the sound of whistling lead charming. The Braddock debacle and the red-hot uniforms. The British Crown, upon hearing that a 20-something colonial amateur had committed an act of war and then confessed to it on paper, decided the solution was to send a proper European gentleman to fix the mess. Enter General Edward Braddock. Braddock was dispatched the following year, 1755, with 2,000 professional British regulars marching in neat, crisp, bright red columns. The perfect uniform for blending into a forest, made entirely of green and brown. Braddock's philosophy, shared by many European generals, was simple. If you march slowly, in perfect geometric formation, and maintained strict adherence to 17th century tactical theory. The enemy will surely apologize and surrender out of respect for your discipline. The French, however, decided to break tradition, teaming up with their highly effective Native American allies. They set up an ambush near Fort Duquesne. On July 9, 1755, Braddock's force wandered directly into a hail of fire originating from the tree lines above. The British regulars attempted to form neat ranks, which only ensured that one enemy musket ball could take out 3 fashionable redcoats at once. Braddock, mortally wounded, lost nearly 1,000 men. The entire expedition was a disastrous fashion show, ruined by snipers. Meanwhile, Washington, who had somehow managed to survive the slaughter, earned his first taste of respect, proving that his earlier blunder was just practice. He looked at the chaos and realized that perhaps the charming whistling sound was best enjoyed when one was not standing in the center of a perfectly arranged, brightly colored target cluster. While Braddock was failing spectacularly on land, far across the Atlantic, the British were employing a strategy far more successful and far less gentlemanly: the art of legalized piracy. War had not been formally declared yet, but in the halls of the Admiralty, the question was posed. Why wait? Britain, possessing the world's superior navy, decided to fully exercise its naval power by simply treating the high seas like their private hunting grounds. They began boarding and capturing hundreds of French merchant ships, seizing cargo ranging from lucrative sugar to essential tea. If you were French, this was unmitigated criminal piracy. If you were British, this was sound strategy. The British rationale was simple. If France can't get its colonial goods to market, it can't fund its armies. Why bother declaring war when you can just declare open season on French imports and ruin their GDP first? This rampant naval theft became a major incitement. France was bleeding revenue, and the constant threat of having your entire cargo of Caribbean molasses seized by a grinning British captain was proving exceptionally irritating to King Louis XV's finance minister. This escalation, the naval raids, and the growing colonial skirmishes finally forced the issue. 2 years after Washington signed his ill-fated confession, Great Britain and France formally declared war on each other in 1756. But to understand why this property dispute in Pennsylvania suddenly became a global catastrophe, we need to talk about Europe, alliances, and the most disastrous assumption Frederick the Great ever made: the diplomatic revolution. When your best frenemy betrays you, rewind slightly to 1748, at the end of the War of the Austrian Succession. That war had concluded mostly inconclusively, save for one massive upset. Prussia, under the intensely clever, intensely cynical King Frederick II, Frederick the Great, had acquired the resource-rich region of Silesia from Austria. Austrian Empress Maria Theresa was not the forgiving type. She viewed the loss of Silesia the way a modern homeowner views a disastrous tax assessment. She would have it back. An Austrian attempt to reclaim Silesia was a guaranteed future event. Frederick, a man who saw foreign policy as a perpetual game of chess played against incompetent opponents, began preparing for war, knowing Austria and its traditional ally, Russia, would soon gang up on him. He penned a famous observation: of all of our neighbors, Russia is the most dangerous. Those who come after me will be well advised to cultivate those barbarians. Note, Frederick's idea of cultivating a barbarian was usually restricted to bribing their generals, or occasionally inviting them to dinner, but never actually trusting them. In 1756, Frederick made his move. He signed an alliance with Great Britain. This seemed logical. Britain wanted to protect its German possession, Hanover, from France.
Here, Your Majesty.
Frederick needed money and protection from Austria. The alliance was sound. The problem was Frederick's monumental political arrogance. Frederick didn't even bother resigning his pre-existing alliance with France.
Look at the map.
Why? Because he operated on the deeply held belief that France always hated Austria. It was historical tradition, like the British Navy engaging in piracy, or colonists complaining about taxes. Franco-Austrian enmity was a constant of nature. He also assumed that Louis XV's famously manipulative mistress, Madame de Pompadour, who thoroughly despised Frederick, often referring to him as that nasty little man, would nonetheless urge the king to stay out of a European conflict, allowing France to focus purely on the profitable colonial wars. Frederick assumed wrong. 4 months later, France reluctantly signed the First Treaty of Versailles, aligning themselves with their old enemies, the Austrians and the Russians. The diplomatic revolution was complete. The established order of Europe had flipped, creating a tangled, confusing web of alliances intended to preserve peace, which, naturally, led to a vicious outbreak of total war across the continent.
They called it.
France and Austria, once mortal enemies, were now allies, bound by a shared desire to either protect Hanover or crush Prussia. The stage was set for the ultimate mercenary sponsorship deal in history. William Pitt and the global spreadsheet, while Frederick was having a catastrophic realization about the limits of French mistress diplomacy. In London, a man named William Pitt the Elder was stepping into power as Prime Minister. Pitt was not interested in charming whistling bullets or historical enmity. Pitt was interested in mathematics. Pitt saw the war not as a matter of glorious honor, but as a global accounting problem. He observed the map. Britain's strength was the navy and cash. France's strength was its massive, well-trained army. Fighting the French army on the European mainland was an expensive, losing proposition. Pitt's strategy was ruthlessly pragmatic. Why pay for the entire European show when you can just pay someone else to do the heavy lifting? He devised a plan so simple, it was almost offensive to 18th century sensibilities. Strategy Part 1. Fund Frederick. Instead of wasting British troops on the mainland, Pitt would pour endless subsidies cash into supporting his Prussian allies. Frederick, the high-energy, constantly besieged military genius, would act as Britain's infinitely expensive, but highly effective proxy ground force, keeping the French, Austrians, and Russians preoccupied in Europe. This would keep George II's beloved Hanover safe and satisfy British continental commitments, without the British losing too many uniforms. Strategy Part 2. Global attrition. With Europe distracted by Frederick's drama, Pitt could initiate the main agenda, using the Navy to open up additional, lesser defended colonial fronts across the globe, North America, India, and the Caribbean. France simply could not contend with Britain's naval supremacy spread across 5 continents. The goal was to financially choke France until they begged for peace and ceded all their valuable overseas properties. Pitt looked at the world not as a globe of nations, but as a vast real estate portfolio, ripe for hostile takeover. The French distraction. The colonial struggle finally made its way to Europe when the French captured the British fort of Saint Philippe on the island of Minorca in June 1756. This was partly revenge for the British piracy campaign, and it provided the final justification for the immediately agreed to Pitt's 2-part plan. Pitt got his budget, and Frederick got his allowance. Frederick, however, needed that allowance immediately. Surrounded by Austria, Russia, and now his supposed Ally turned enemy France. He saw only one path, a preemptive strike. His goal was to sweep through Saxony, a neutral state, forcibly conscript their army, as if they were signing up for a gym membership they couldn't read, appropriate their treasury, and then march on Vienna. But the Saxons, insulted by being treated as a mobile bank account, put up a bitter fight. By the time the Saxon king finally surrendered in October, Frederick had wasted precious time and Prussian lives while he was busy with this expensive distraction. The Austrians successfully invaded and occupied the southern portion of Silesia. Things were going rather poorly for Frederick, whose allowance from Pitt was still in the mail. And in America, the British were still demonstrating an impressive inability to hold wooden fences, losing Fort Bull and Fort William Henry. The global property acquisition was off to a terrible start. The coup in Calcutta. Pitt's strategy, however, was designed to win a war of attrition, not a sprint. While Frederick was busy losing money in Europe, Pitt's attention turned to the east, the lucrative, volatile world of the Mughal Empire's collapse. 1757 saw the opening of the third major theater of war, India, fought between the British and French East India companies. This was less a war of kings and more a corporate takeover attempt. Both states were vying to fill the power vacuum left by the ailing Mughal Empire. The inciting incident had occurred the previous summer in Bengal, where the local ruler, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, had captured several British soldiers and imprisoned them in a small military jail, known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. Most died from suffocation and disease. This provided the British East India Company with the moral outrage necessary to initiate a full-scale stock market coup. Disguised as an act of retribution, enter Colonel Robert Clive, a man renowned for his aggressive temperament and his absolute lack of concern for fair play. In June 1757, Clive faced Siraj-ud-Dowlah's forces. At the Battle of Plassey, the British were outnumbered roughly 16 to 1, with no cavalry. By all accounts, this should have been a rout, but history is often decided by meteorology and opportunistic bribery. Clive had already secretly negotiated with key figures in Siraj's army, convincing them to switch sides mid-battle. But the critical moment came from the skies. A sudden, torrential monsoon rain began. The Indian army, utilizing the standard gunpowder of the day, saw their powder supplies ruined by the downpour. They were soaked, demoralized, and useless. The Indian commanders, assuming the British suffered the same fate, launched a cavalry charge, hoping to crush the rain-drenched enemy. They assumed wrong. Clive, a cautious man regarding his volatile assets, had cleverly kept his gunpowder dry. As the Indian cavalry charged, expecting damp squibs, they were instead blown away by concentrated British artillery fire. The battle was over in hours. Clive had secured French-aligned Bengal, effectively dismantling French influence in India. The corporate takeover was successful. The British had acquired their first massive global asset, purchased with dry powder, bribery, and exceptional timing. Frederick's miracles and the perpetual grind. Back in Europe, Frederick was attempting to compensate for his losses with audacious aggression. He spent the spring of 1757 cutting a bloody swath through Bohemia, eventually besieging Prague. Maria Theresa, however, was also not short on brilliant commanders. Her Count Leopold von Daun led a relief, force that dislodged the Prussian king at the Battle of Colonial in June. Frederick was defeated. Adding insult to injury, reports arrived of a Russian invasion of East Prussia. Tsarina Elizabeth's forces had taken the city of Memel. Frederick was forced to turn back. Meanwhile, the French, attempting to capture Hanover, succeeded in defeating the British and Hanoverian forces at the Battle of Hostenbeck. This resulted in a peace treaty between the French and Hanover, the Convention of Klosterhaven, in September. Frederick was furious. His main sponsor, Hanover under the British crown, had tapped out of the European war, leaving Frederick alone against the combined might of France, Austria, and Russia. At this point, the last thing Frederick needed was another enemy. So, naturally, he got another enemy. Sweden, smelling weakness, opportunistically invaded Pomerania that summer. Frederick was now outnumbered, surrounded, and financially dependent on the often slow-moving financial transfers from Pitt. Pitt's guineas must be shipped, not delivered by magical carriage, Frederick complained in a letter to his general, probably while polishing his boots. Yet, despite the impossible odds, 1757 would see. Frederick produced two of his most stunning battlefield victories, solidifying his reputation as a genius, albeit a genius constantly on the verge of bankruptcy. First, in November, he faced the massive French army at the Battle of Rossbach. Frederick, using his signature maneuverability and speed, decisively defeated the vastly superior French forces. A month later, he routed the Austrians at the Battle of Leuthen. Despite being outnumbered, Frederick considered Leuthen his greatest achievement. He had proven his tactical brilliance. But the problem remained. Every time he defeated one enemy, two more seemed to pop up. Funded by Maria Theresa's enduring wrath, the tide turns in North America, 1758. The start of 1758 saw the Anglo-Prussian alliance bleeding profusely in Europe. But Pitt's global strategy was beginning to pay dividends overseas. Pitt realized that the key to victory lay in the permanent destruction of French capacity to project power, focusing on securing the highest value real estate. The year 1758 marked a decisive shift in the North American conflict. While the French held on the troublesome Fort Carillon, Ticonderoga, the British managed two critical captures: Louisbourg in Canada, providing a vital naval base, and, finally, Fort Duquesne in Pennsylvania. Fort Duquesne, that troublesome French position near the Ohio Valley. The very land dispute that George Washington had accidentally confessed to escalating was finally wrested from French control. It was promptly renamed Fort Pitt, located roughly in today's downtown Pittsburgh. The symbolism was clear. The local squabble was resolved, and Pitt's strategy of global acquisition was literally stamping his name on the map. In addition to military victories, Pitt also oversaw a campaign of brutal efficiency. When Massachusetts militia took control of Fort Beauséjour, they secured the area known as Acadia, modern Nova Scotia. The British concluded that the French-speaking civilian population, the Acadians, posed a security risk. Historian Fred Anderson noted this was possibly the first time in modern history that a civilian population was forcibly removed as a security risk. This mass deportation, known chillingly as Le Grand Dérangement, the Great Upheaval, resulted in the forcible removal of 11,500 Acadians. Many died from disease or shipwrecks. It was a grim reminder that this war was, fundamentally, about eliminating anyone who complicated British property titles. The land was now cleared, secured, and ready for British settlers, India and Europe. The global tug of war. In India, French forces, sensing an opening while most British troops were tied up in Bengal, launched an attack on Fort St. David and the city of Madras. They successfully captured the fort. However, once again, the elements intervened. Heavy monsoon rains and poor preparation cost the French precious time by the time they began their siege. On Madras in December, The British were prepared. After a month of fighting, 6 British ships loaded, with men and supplies, breached the blockade, forcing the French to withdraw. The Navy, Pitt's secret weapon, always arrived on time to save the expensive assets. Meanwhile, back in the Central European slaughterhouse, Frederick was having another terrible, brilliant year. The Russians re-entered East Prussia, which they would hold for the next 4 years, constrained only by their chronic inability to manage supply lines. In August, Frederick fought the Russians at the Battle of Zorndorf. The battle was a bloody stalemate, with both sides taking heavy casualties. The final major event of the year came in October at the Saxon village of Hochkirch. Frederick, having successfully defeated the enemy on several occasions, developed a fatal flaw: overconfidence in his ability to read his adversaries. He faced Count Leopold von Daun, the same Austrian, who had beaten him at Colonial. Von Daun had a reputation as an overly cautious commander who never attacked, unless he had perfect positioning. Frederick, having repeatedly failed to goad von Daun into battle, began to believe the Austrian commander would simply never make a move. Frederick slept soundly that night. At 5 a.m. on October 14th, the church bell struck, and 80,000 Austrian soldiers attacked the sleeping Prussian camp. Frederick's 35,000 men were caught completely by surprise. The battle was brutal, lasting only 5 hours before the Prussians were in full retreat, leaving behind nearly all their artillery and 9,400 men. It should have been the death blow, the total, humiliating collapse of the Anglo-Prussian continental strategy. But von Daun, true to form, reaffirmed his supremely cautious reputation, choosing not to pursue the retreating Prussians. He had won the battle, but Frederick was allowed to limp away and survive. The state of the global ledger. As 1758 drew to a close, the war was in full swing, and the Anglo-Prussian alliance was in a precarious, contradictory state. In Europe, Frederick was a bloody, exhausted genius, staggering under the weight of 3 massive continental powers, constantly sending desperate letters to London for more cash. The European war had been bought and paid for by Pitt, but the purchase was proving incredibly costly in lives. Globally, however, Pitt's strategy was dominating. The Navy was supreme. Colonial assets were being systematically acquired, and the French financial system was creaking under the strain of both naval piracy and the cost of supporting Maria Theresa's vendetta. The names of British forts, Louisbourg, Fort Pitt, Madras, were changing, reflecting the new owners. The war was less about honor and more about acquisition. The British had secured Canada, were dismantling the French in India, and were subsidizing the destruction of Central Europe. The next year, 1759, would be known as Annus Mirabilis, the year of miracles for the British, confirming their global dominance at sea and in the colonies. But for Frederick the Great, the drama was far from over. He still had the ghosts of Rossbach, the financial demands of Pitt, and the entire continent waiting to pounce. In fact, his darkest hour was yet to come. His ambitious signature battle maneuver, the double envelopment, was about to be met by a Russian army that was prepared, focused, and thoroughly unimpressed with Prussian tactical flair. Frederick was about to suffer a defeat so profound, so terrifying, that he would consider abdication. The Anglo-Prussian alliance was winning the war of global real estate, but its European proxy was about to be utterly annihilated, necessitating the intervention of an improbable, historically bizarre figure to save the whole operation. A deeply disturbed, tragically short-lived Tsar, who happened to be obsessed with Prussian military drills. The financial ruin of France was guaranteed. The fate of Frederick the Great, however, now rested entirely on the whims of a Russian fanboy.